The Seabreeze Resort looked like a postcard brought to life. White stone walls, palm shadows dancing on the glass, and an ocean so blue it seemed staged for the wealthy. In the middle of that polished perfection, a single dad walked in holding his little boy's hand, carrying nothing but a worn backpack and the quiet hope that this trip might finally make his son smile again. He didn't look like the kind of guest the staff expected in a luxury lobby, and that was exactly the problem. The receptionist's smile tightened the moment she saw him. A second glance turned into a long stare, then into whispered words behind the desk. The father kept his voice calm, repeating his reservation details while his son stared up at the chandelier like it was a sky full of stars. But the air shifted, subtle at first, then sharp. A female manager stepped forward, heels clicking like a warning, and spoke to him as if he were already guilty. Her tone wasn't just cold, it was certain. When he tried to explain, she leaned closer, eyes narrowed, and accused him of scamming his way into a suite he couldn't afford. The boy's fingers tightened around his father's. Then, in a single, humiliating flash, the manager raised her hand and slapped him, hard, right there in his own hotel. The lobby fell silent, and the father didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He only reached into his pocket, took out his phone, and made one call that would change everything in exactly 9 minutes. The Seabreeze Resort rose along the coastline like a monument to indulgence, its glass walls catching the afternoon sun and scattering light across the marble lobby where everything smelled faintly of citrus and expensive polish. Guests drifted through the space with effortless confidence, their conversations low, their movements unhurried, as if time itself slowed to accommodate those who could afford it. Into that world walked a single father holding his young son's hand, his steps measured, his expression calm but alert. He wore simple clothes, clean yet unremarkable, and carried a backpack that had clearly seen years of use. For him, this place was not a display of wealth, but a promise he had made to his child. A promise that after years of saying maybe next time, there would finally be a moment just for them, somewhere quiet, somewhere beautiful, somewhere the boy could forget for a while that his family was smaller than most. The child's eyes widened as they entered the lobby, drawn upward by the towering chandelier that shimmered like a constellation trapped indoors, and he tugged lightly at his father's hand, whispering questions filled with wonder. The father smiled faintly, that familiar, restrained smile of someone who had learned to ration joy carefully, and guided him toward the front desk. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The receptionist offered a practiced smile and asked for the reservation details, fingers gliding across the keyboard. But as seconds stretched into a minute, the smile stiffened. Her eyes flicked up, then down again, scanning the screen as if something were wrong. She asked for identification, then for a confirmation email, then for an additional document that was not typically required. The father complied without comment, handing over each item calmly, though he could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tension that came when courtesy was replaced by suspicion. Other guests approached neighboring counters and were checked in quickly, warmly, offered complimentary drinks and ocean view upgrades, while he stood waiting, his son growing quiet at his side. When he gently asked if there was a problem, the receptionist responded with a polite but distant tone, suggesting there might be an issue with the booking category. Before he could reply, a sharp sound echoed across the lobby, the decisive click of heels against marble, and a female manager appeared beside the desk. She didn't introduce herself. She did not greet the child. Her gaze swept over the father in a single assessing glance that lingered too long, as if cataloging every detail that did not fit her expectations. She spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, questioning the validity of the reservation and implying that mistakes like this happened when people tried to book accommodations beyond their means. The father felt his son tense, felt the small hand grip tighter, and he placed his other hand reassuringly on the boy's shoulder, responding in an even, respectful voice that the reservation had been confirmed weeks ago. The manager's expression hardened. She interrupted him mid-sentence, accusing him of causing delays and disrupting service, her words edged with irritation and something colder beneath it. A faint flush crept up her neck as she leaned closer, lowering her voice only slightly, warning him that fraudulent bookings would not be tolerated at a resort of this caliber. Around them, staff members averted their eyes, suddenly absorbed in screens and paperwork, while a few guests slowed their steps, sensing conflict but unwilling to involve themselves. The father straightened, his posture calm but resolute, and repeated that he had done nothing wrong. That was when the manager lost whatever restraint she had been pretending to maintain. With a sharp inhale and a movement so sudden it stunned the room, she raised her hand and struck him across the face. The sound was loud, echoing off the marble and glass, slicing through the ambient music like a blade. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop. Conversations died mid-word. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered near the entrance. The father staggered half a step from the force, not from pain, but from surprise, and then steadied himself. His cheek burned, but he did not raise his voice or his hand. He did not even look at the manager at first. Instead, he looked down at his son, whose eyes were wide with shock, confusion, and fear, and knelt slowly until they were face to face. He spoke softly, telling him to breathe, telling him that everything was okay, that sometimes adults made mistakes, and that he was safe. The calmness of his reaction unsettled the lobby more than anger ever could. The manager scoffed, accusing him of playing the victim, ordering security to escort him out immediately. Yet no one moved. The guards hesitated. The receptionist looked frozen, hands hovering uselessly above the keyboard. The father rose to his feet, his expression unreadable now, and gently guided his son to stand beside him. Only then did he turn his attention to the manager, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze that carried no threat, only certainty. Without saying a word, he reached into his pocket and took out his phone. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if time no longer pressed on him. He stepped slightly away from the desk, enough to give his son space, and placed a call. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, and he said very little, just his name, his location, and a brief description of what had occurred. He ended the call before anyone could react. The manager laughed dismissively, making a comment about imaginary connections and warning him that theatrics would not save him from being removed. But the atmosphere had already changed. Within moments, phones behind the desk began to ring. A supervisor whispered urgently to another employee. The receptionist's face drained of color as she listened to instructions she clearly did not expect. The manager's smile faltered when her own phone vibrated, and she stepped aside to answer, her tone shifting from arrogance to confusion. The father stood silently, one hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder as the first minute ticked by, then the second, the weight of anticipation growing heavier with each passing second. No one spoke. No one moved. Outside, the ocean continued its steady rhythm, waves rolling in and out, indifferent to the tension building within the walls of the resort. The manager returned from her call, visibly unsettled, demanding to know who the man was and why corporate was suddenly involved. The father did not answer. He did not need to. Somewhere far above them, decisions were already being made, and the polished illusion of untouchable luxury had begun to crack, setting the stage for a reckoning that would unfold minute by minute, leaving nothing and no one unchanged. The third minute after the call passed in a silence so dense, it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on everyone in the lobby. The manager stood rigid near the front desk, her earlier confidence bleeding away in small, involuntary gestures, the tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled and uncurled at her side, the repeated glance toward the entrance as if expecting backup that never came. Guests who had initially tried to ignore the incident now lingered openly, drawn by the unmistakable sense that something irreversible was unfolding. The father remained where he was, his posture relaxed but immovable, his presence oddly grounding in the chaos he had not created. He bent slightly toward his son and murmured something meant only for him, a quiet reassurance that steadied the boy's breathing, and for a brief moment the world narrowed to that small circle of calm amid the tension. Behind the desk, the receptionist's phone rang again, and this time her hands shook as she answered, nodding repeatedly while murmuring apologies to someone on the other end. When she hung up, she avoided looking at the manager, her eyes instead fixed on the counter as if it might offer refuge. The manager noticed, of course, and her irritation flared anew, snapping at the receptionist for not maintaining professionalism, yet her words lacked their former sharpness. Another minute passed. Security received instructions through their earpieces, and instead of approaching the father, they subtly repositioned themselves near the exits, a detail that did not go unnoticed by those paying attention. The manager's phone vibrated again, and this time when she answered, her voice dropped to a hushed, almost pleading register. She turned her back to the lobby, pacing a few steps, nodding, shaking her head, then freezing altogether as whatever she heard stripped the color from her face. When she ended the call, she stood perfectly still, staring at the floor as if it had suddenly become unstable beneath her feet. The father watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of weary understanding. He had seen this moment before in different forms, the instant when assumed power met undeniable reality, and he knew how quickly arrogance could unravel once its foundation was exposed. By the 5th minute, a low murmur rippled through the staff as internal communications lit up across devices. Supervisors whispered to each other, names were mentioned, and schedules were hastily pulled up, as if the resort itself were bracing for impact. The manager attempted to regain control, clapping her hands sharply and demanding that everyone return to their stations, but her authority no longer carried weight. A junior staff member hesitated before complying, and that hesitation spoke louder than defiance ever could. The father shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between the manager and his son without overt confrontation, a protective instinct as natural as breathing. He felt the sting on his cheek fade, replaced by a dull warmth, but the real ache sat deeper, a reminder of how easily dignity could be dismissed when appearances dictated judgment. He thought briefly of the years that had shaped him, the long nights after his wife's death, learning to braid hair and pack lunches, balancing meetings and school pickups, building an empire while remaining invisible within it. This visit had never been about catching someone in the act of wrongdoing. It had been about seeing whether the values he believed in still lived within the walls of what he had helped create. The answer was unfolding before him in stark clarity. At the 7th minute, the large digital display behind the front desk flickered unexpectedly, drawing every eye in the lobby. The ambient music cut out, replaced by a faint tone, signaling an incoming call routed through the resort's central system. The manager's head snapped up, panic flashing across her features as she realized what was about to happen. She took an instinctive step forward, as if she could stop it, but it was already too late. The screen illuminated, revealing the composed face of the chairman of the resort's parent company, seated in a minimalist boardroom flanked by legal counsel and senior executives. His gaze was stern, not angry, but deeply disappointed. He did not acknowledge the manager at first. Instead, his eyes found the father, and his expression softened slightly as he addressed him by name, apologizing for the incident in clear, unequivocal terms. A collective gasp rippled through the lobby as the reality of the situation crashed down on those who had been watching. The father inclined his head politely, acknowledging the apology without triumph, while the manager stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The chairman then turned his attention to her, his voice measured and precise as he asked for an explanation. She stammered, words tumbling over one another in a desperate attempt to justify her actions, citing policy, miscommunication, and perceived threats that no longer sounded convincing even to herself. The chairman listened without interruption, then glanced briefly at the legal counsel beside him before speaking again, his tone final. He announced that an immediate internal review was underway and that preliminary decisions would be made on the spot. The father was asked how he wished to proceed, and for a moment the lobby held its breath. He looked down at his son, then around at the staff who had stood by in silence, and finally back at the screen. When he spoke, his voice carried calmly through the space, resonant without being loud. He said that the issue was not personal humiliation, but systemic failure. He spoke of respect as the true measure of luxury, of how a single act of abuse revealed a culture that prioritized image over humanity. He noted the absence of intervention, the way fear and complacency had allowed wrongdoing to escalate unchecked. Each word landed with deliberate weight, not as an accusation, but as an observation, leaving no room for denial. The manager's shoulders sagged as the full scope of her actions became undeniable, and tears welled in her eyes, though whether from regret or self-preservation was unclear. The father finished by stating that accountability was necessary, not as punishment, but as a foundation for change. He stepped back, signaling that he had said all he needed to say. The chairman nodded slowly, his decision evident. He announced the immediate termination of the manager, effective without severance, citing gross misconduct and violation of company values. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the lobby as security approached her, not roughly but firmly, guiding her away from the desk she had ruled moments earlier. Her protests dissolved into quiet sobs as she was escorted out, the sound of her heels fading down the corridor like an echo of misplaced authority. The chairman then addressed the remaining staff, outlining further investigations and temporary suspensions for those directly involved or complicit, his words leaving a wake of stunned silence in their path. The call ended as abruptly as it had begun, the screen returning to its idle display. In the aftermath, the lobby felt strangely hollow, as if the air had been swept clean. The father exhaled slowly, a release he had not realized he was holding, and turned his attention back to his son, asking softly if he was ready to see the ocean. The boy nodded, still processing what he had witnessed, and together they walked toward the glass doors leading outside, leaving behind a space forever altered by 9 minutes of truth and the quiet resolve of a man who had chosen integrity over spectacle. In the minutes that followed their departure from the lobby, the resort moved as if it were waking from a long and uneasy dream. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, footsteps echoed with unfamiliar caution, and the staff who remained behind the front desk worked with a nervous precision, aware that every gesture now carried meaning. Outside, the father and his son stepped onto the wide stone terrace that opened toward the beach, and for the first time since their arrival, the boy inhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing as the salty breeze brushed his face. The father watched him for a moment, allowing himself a quiet breath of relief, yet his mind remained tethered to what had just unfolded. He knew the spectacle in the lobby was only the surface of a deeper reckoning that had begun, one that would ripple through every department of the resort. As they walked slowly toward the shoreline, the father's phone vibrated repeatedly in his pocket, messages and calls from executives, legal teams, and operations managers pouring in, each seeking guidance, reassurance, or approval. He ignored them for now, choosing instead to remain present, to let his son chase the foam of retreating waves and laugh as his shoes filled with sand. That laughter, light and unguarded, reminded him why he had endured years of restraint, why he had hidden his identity so carefully even within his own company. He had built the resort on ideals of excellence and respect, not to create a playground for entitlement, and witnessing how easily those ideals had been compromised stirred a quiet disappointment within him. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the beach, a senior operations director approached hesitantly, maintaining a respectful distance. She apologized sincerely, not with corporate phrasing but with visible remorse, explaining that the manager's behavior had been the subject of prior complaints that were never fully addressed. The father listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than accusatory. He asked a few pointed questions about reporting structures, training protocols, and accountability measures, each question revealing gaps that could no longer be ignored. The director admitted the failures plainly, acknowledging that comfort and profit had been allowed to overshadow vigilance. The father nodded slowly, absorbing the information, and thanked her for her honesty. He made it clear that transparency from this point forward was not optional, and that the future of the resort depended on rebuilding trust from the inside out. The director left with renewed purpose, and as she disappeared into the building, the father felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. Leadership, he reflected, was not about being unseen when things went well, but about stepping forward when they did not, even if it meant dismantling systems he had once trusted. That evening, the resort's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Staff members moved with a humility that had not been present before, their greetings softer, their attentiveness genuine rather than rehearsed. In the dining area overlooking the ocean, the father and son were seated quietly at a small table, the boy animatedly describing the shapes he saw in the clouds while the father listened, smiling, grounding himself in the simplicity of the moment. Around them, other guests whispered about the incident, piecing together fragments of what they had witnessed, speculating about the man's identity and the consequences that would follow. The father remained indifferent to the attention, focused instead on the child across from him, on ensuring that the memory of this trip would not be defined solely by conflict. Yet even as he cut his food and nodded at his son's stories, his mind worked steadily, outlining the changes that needed to be made. He envisioned comprehensive retraining programs centered on empathy, anonymous reporting channels with real enforcement, leadership evaluations that measured character as rigorously as performance. The slap in the lobby had been an overt act of disrespect, but he knew the more dangerous issues were the quiet ones, the habits and assumptions that went unchallenged because they were convenient. Later, As darkness settled and lanterns illuminated the pathways through the resort, the father received a final call he could not ignore. It was the chairman again, informing him that preliminary findings had revealed a pattern of complaints against several supervisors, complaints that had been minimized or dismissed under the guise of protecting the brand. The father closed his eyes briefly, a mixture of anger and resolve tightening his chest. He authorized an immediate independent audit of the resort's management practices and instructed that no one, regardless of tenure or performance metrics, be exempt from review. His voice was calm, but its firmness left no doubt that this was not a symbolic gesture. When the call ended, he stood on the balcony of their room, overlooking the moonlit ocean, listening to the waves crash rhythmically below. He thought of the manager being escorted out earlier, of the fear in her eyes when her power vanished, and he felt no satisfaction, only a somber understanding of how quickly unchecked authority could corrupt. He hoped, not for her sake alone but for the sake of everyone involved, that the experience would serve as a catalyst for reflection rather than bitterness. The next morning, the resort awoke to a new order. Staff briefings were held at dawn, policies reviewed line by line, and an unspoken awareness settled over the grounds like mist. The father watched from a distance as employees gathered, their faces serious, their posture attentive, and he recognized the fragile potential in the moment. Change, he knew, was never guaranteed by punishment alone. It required sustained commitment and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He resolved to remain involved, not as an invisible owner, but as a present steward, at least long enough to ensure the course correction took hold. As his son joined him, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking if they could swim before breakfast, the father smiled and nodded, reminded again that this journey was as much about modeling values as it was about enforcing them. Together they walked toward the beach, the horizon glowing with early light, while behind them the resort continued its uneasy but necessary transformation, shaped by a single moment of injustice and the quiet determination of a man who refused to let it define him or the legacy he would leave behind. By the final day of their stay, the Seabreeze Resort no longer felt like the same place the father and his son had entered days earlier. The change was not visible in the marble floors or the ocean-facing glass walls, but in the way people moved, spoke, and looked at one another. There was a carefulness now, not born of fear alone but of awareness, as if everyone understood that something fragile had been broken and rebuilt at the same time. Early that morning, the father stood by the shoreline watching his son run along the wet sand, laughter cutting through the steady rhythm of the waves. The boy had recovered quickly, as children often do, but the father had not forgotten the moment in the lobby, nor would he allow it to fade into a convenient lesson quickly learned and just as quickly ignored. His phone buzzed intermittently with updates from the audit team, summaries of interviews, and recommendations for immediate reforms. Each message confirmed what he had suspected. The slap had been a symptom, not the disease. Patterns of intimidation, silent compliance, and selective enforcement of rules had shaped the resort's internal culture for years, protected by performance metrics and profit margins that told only half the story. As the sun climbed higher, the father made a decision that would define not only the future of the resort, but his role within it. He convened a closed-door meeting with department heads, not in a boardroom, but in a modest conference space overlooking the ocean, deliberately stripping away the trappings of hierarchy. When he entered, conversation stopped instantly. He did not introduce himself with titles or credentials. He spoke plainly, recounting what had happened in the lobby not as a personal grievance but as a case study in failure. He explained how power, when left unexamined, inevitably drifted toward abuse, and how silence, when normalized, became complicity. His tone was calm, almost reflective, yet every word carried the weight of lived experience. He told them that luxury hospitality was not about exclusivity, but about trust, and that trust could only exist where respect was non-negotiable. There would be consequences, he said, and there would also be opportunity. Those willing to unlearn old habits and commit to a new standard would be supported fully. Those who resisted would find no place in what the resort was becoming. No one interrupted him. No one argued. When he finished, the room remained quiet for several seconds before, one by one, the managers nodded, understanding that this was not a speech meant to inspire applause, but a line drawn with unmistakable clarity. That afternoon, as training sessions began and external consultants arrived, the father returned to being simply a guest again, though now the staff greeted him with genuine warmth rather than forced politeness. He noticed small changes already taking root. A concierge stepping in to assist a confused elderly couple without hesitation, a server gently correcting a colleague who spoke dismissively to a guest, a supervisor thanking an employee publicly for de-escalating a tense situation with patience instead of authority. These moments were modest, easily overlooked, yet to the father they signaled something far more important than structural reform, a shift in mindset. Sitting on a shaded bench while his son built an elaborate sandcastle, the father reflected on how close he had come to allowing the incident to end differently. It would have been easy to retaliate immediately, to expose his identity with dramatic flair, to let outrage dictate his response. Instead, restraint had given the truth room to surface, and in that space, accountability had followed. He knew not every story ended this way, that countless injustices went unanswered, but he also knew that leadership meant acting decisively when the opportunity to correct course presented itself. On their last evening, the resort hosted a quiet gathering for staff only, not as a celebration, but as a moment of acknowledgement. The father attended briefly, standing at the back of the room while a newly appointed interim manager spoke about rebuilding trust from the ground up. The manager emphasized listening, transparency, and shared responsibility, words that might once have sounded hollow but now carried urgency. When the father was invited to say a few words, he declined the podium, choosing instead to speak from where he stood. He thanked the staff for their willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and reminded them that change was not an event, but a daily choice reflected in countless small actions. He spoke of his son, of the kind of world he hoped the boy would inherit, one where respect was not conditional and dignity was not tied to appearance or status. His voice faltered only once, briefly, before he steadied himself and finished by saying that the true measure of success would be what happened after the attention faded. When he stepped away, there was no applause, only thoughtful silence, the kind that lingered long after words ended. The following morning, as they prepared to leave, the boy asked if they could come back someday. The question caught the father off guard, and he considered it carefully before answering. He told his son that places could change, just like people, and that what mattered was whether they learned from their mistakes. The boy nodded solemnly, satisfied with the explanation, and ran ahead toward the car. As the father took one last look at the resort, he felt neither pride nor regret, but a quiet sense of responsibility fulfilled, at least for now. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the property, waves rolling in with patient consistency, erasing yesterday's footprints while making room for new ones. As they drove away, the resort receded into the distance, no longer just a symbol of luxury, but a reminder that systems, like people, revealed their true nature not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge. And somewhere within its walls, long after the story stopped being told, the lesson remained, carried forward by those who had witnessed how 9 minutes of truth, restraint, and courage were enough to dismantle arrogance, expose silence, and begin the slow, necessary work of change. Months later, long after the incident at the Seabreeze Resort had faded from public curiosity and internal memos alike, its impact continued to unfold in quieter, more meaningful ways. The father returned to his routine life, balancing board meetings with school drop-offs, investor calls with bedtime stories, his identity once again shielded from the world by deliberate choice. Yet something within him had shifted. He found himself more present, more attuned to the subtle ways power moved through people and systems, more willing to intervene early rather than trust that values would protect themselves. The resort, under new leadership, became a case study within the company, not one of scandal, but of transformation. Anonymous employee surveys showed rising confidence in reporting concerns, guest feedback reflected warmth rather than intimidation, and turnover decreased as trust slowly replaced fear. None of these changes made headlines, and that was exactly how the father wanted it. For him, the true success of that day was not the firings or the authority revealed, but the fact that his son no longer spoke about the slap with confusion or fear, but with understanding. One evening, as they sat together assembling a model ship at the kitchen table, the boy asked why some people thought they were better than others. The father paused, choosing his words carefully, and explained that sometimes people borrowed confidence from their position instead of building it from character, and that when that position disappeared, so did the borrowed strength. He told his son that respect was something you practiced, not something you demanded, and that real strength showed itself in how you treated those who could offer you nothing in return. The boy nodded, absorbing the lesson in his own quiet way, then returned to fitting the tiny pieces together, focused and patient. In that moment, the father felt a deeper sense of closure than any formal apology or corporate reform could have given him. The memory of the lobby, the slap, the stunned silence, all of it softened into context rather than wound. It had been a test not only of a system, but of his own restraint, his priorities, and the example he was setting. Somewhere along the coastline, the Seabreeze Resort continued to welcome guests who would never know how close its foundations had come to cracking completely, never realizing that the calm professionalism they now experienced had been forged in a moment of reckoning. And that was enough. The story did not need to be retold loudly because its purpose had already been served. In the end, a single father had not gone to a resort to prove who he was, but to remember why he was building anything at all. And in doing so, he left behind something far more lasting than authority or fear, a quiet standard of dignity that, once revealed, could not be unseen.